Alright, so we are picking up here with chapter 15, and when we left off, Edward was kicked out of the train car. Him and Bull and Lucy the dog were kind of sleeping in a train car, and the guards kind of came in, the cops, and basically it was kind of illegal. They were in there illegally hitching rides. So yeah, and he rolled down a hill. In the morning, the sun rose, and the cricket song gave way to bird song, and an old woman came walking down the dirt road and tripped right over Edward. "Phew," she said. She pushed at Edward with her fishing pole. "Looks like a rabbit," she said. She put down her basket and bent and stared at Edward. "Only he ain't real." She stood back up. "Huh," she said again, and she rubbed her back. "What I say is, there's a use for everything, and everything has its use. That's what I say." Edward didn't care what she said. The terrible ache he had felt the night before had gone away and had been replaced with a different feeling, one of hollowness and despair. Pick me up or don't pick me up, the rabbit thought. Makes no difference to me. The old lady picked him up. She bent him double and put him in her basket, which smelled of weeds and fish, and then she kept walking, swinging the basket, singing, "Nobody knows the troubles I seen." Edward, in spite of himself, listened. "I've seen troubles too," he thought. "You bet I have, and apparently they aren't over yet." Edward was right. His troubles were not over. The old woman found a use for him. She hung up from a pole in her vegetable garden. She nailed his ears to the wooden pole and spread his arms out as if he were flying, and attached his paws to the pole by wrapping a piece of wire around them. In addition to Edward, pie tins hung from a pole. They clinked and clanked and shone in the sun. "Ain't a doubt in my mind that you can scare them off," the old lady said. Scare who off? Edward wondered. Birds, he soon discovered. Crows, they were flying at him, cawing and screeching, wheeling over his head, diving at his ears. "Go on, Clyde," said the woman, and she clapped her hands. "You got to act ferocious." Clyde. Edward felt a weariness so intense wash over him that he thought he might actually be able to sing aloud. Would the world never tire of calling him by the wrong name? The old woman clapped her hands again. "Get to work." "Clyde," she said, "scare them birds off," and then she walked away from him out of the garden and toward her small house. The birds were insistent. They flew around his head. They tugged at the loose threads in his sweater. One large crow in particular would not leave the rabbit alone. He perched on the pole and screamed a dark message in Edward's left ear. "Caw, caw, caw," without ceasing. As the sun rose higher and shone meaner and brighter, Edward became somewhat dazed. He mistook the large crow for Pellegrino. "Go ahead," he thought. "Turn me into a warthog if you want. I don't care. I'm done with caring." "Caw, caw," said Pellegrino the crow. Finally the sun set and the birds flew away. Edward hung by his ears and looked up at the night sky. He saw the stars, but for the first time in his life he looked at them and felt no comfort. Instead, he felt mocked. So there's a picture of Edward there. "You are down there alone," the stars seemed to say to him, "and we are up here in our constellations together." "I have been loved," Edward told the stars. "So," said the stars, "what difference does that make when you are all alone?" Edward could think of no answer to that question, and eventually the sky lightened and the stars disappeared one by one. The birds returned and the old woman came back to the garden, and she brought a boy with her. Chapter 16. "Bryce," said the old woman, "get away from that rabbit. I ain't paying you to stand and stare." "Yes, ma'am," said Bryce, and he wiped his nose with the back of his hand and continued to look up at Edward. The boy's eyes were brown with flecks of gold shining in them. "Hey," he whispered to Edward. A crow settled on Edward's head, and the boy flapped his arms and shouted, "Get on, get!" And the bird spread his wings and flew away. "Bryce!" shouted the old woman. "Ma'am?" said Bryce. "Get away from that rabbit. Do your work. I ain't gonna say it again." "Yes'm," said Bryce, and he wiped his hand across his nose. "I'll get back to you," he said to Edward. The rabbit spent the day hanging by his ears, baking in the hot sun, watching the old woman and Bryce weed and hoe the garden, and whenever the woman wasn't looking, Bryce waved a hand and waved. The birds circled over Edward's head, laughing at him. What was it like to have wings? Edward wondered. If he had had wings when he was tossed overboard, he would not have sunk into the bottom of the sea. Instead, he would have flown in the opposite direction, up into the deep, bright blue sky, and when Lolly took him to the dump, he would have flown out of the garbage and followed her and landed on her head, holding on with his sharp claws. And on the train, when the man kicked him, Edward would not have fallen to the ground. Instead, he would have risen up and sat on top of the train and laughed at the man. Caw, caw, caw! In the late afternoon, Bryce and the old lady left the field. Bryce winked at Edward as he walked past him. One of the crows lighted on Edward's shoulder and tapped with his beak at Edward's china face, reminding the rabbit with each tap that he had no wings, that not only could he not fly, he could not move on his own at all, in any way. Dusk descended over the field, and then came true dark. A whippoorwill sang out over and over again, "Whipper-woo, whippoorwill." It was the saddest sound Edward had ever heard. And then came another song, the hum of a harmonica. Bryce stepped out of the shadows. "Hey," he said to Edward, and he wiped his nose with the back of his hand, and then played another bit of song on the harmonica. "I bet you didn't think I'd come back, but here I am. I've come to save you." Too late, thought Edward as Bryce climbed the pole and worked at the wires that were tied around his wrists. "I'm nothing but a hollow rabbit." Too late, thought Edward as Bryce pulled the nails out of his ears. "I'm only a doll made of china." But when the last nail was out and he fell forward into Bryce's arms, the rabbit felt a rush of relief, and the feeling of relief was followed by one of joy. Perhaps, he thought, it is not too late, after all, for me to be saved. Chapter 17. Take a look at that shack there, that house, that little whatever that is. Kind of interesting. Bryce slung Edward over his shoulder and he started to walk. "I've come to get you for Sarah Ruth," Bryce said. "You don't know Sarah Ruth. She's my sister. She's sick. She had her a baby doll made out of china. She loved that baby doll, but he broke it." "He broke it?" "He was drunk and stepped on that baby's head and smashed it into 100 million pieces. Them pieces was so small I couldn't make them go back together. I couldn't. I tried and tried." And at this point in the story, Bryce stopped walking and shook his head and wiped at his nose with the back of his hand. "Sarah Ruth ain't had nothing to play with since. He won't buy her nothing. He said she don't need nothing. He said she don't need nothing because she ain't gonna live. But he don't know." Bryce started to walk again. "He don't know," he said. Who he was not clear to Edward. What was clear was that he was being taken to a child to make up for the loss of a doll. A doll. How Edward loathed dolls, and to be thought of as a likely replacement for a doll offended him. But still, it was hard, he had to admit, a highly preferable alternative to hanging by his ears from a post. The house in which Bryce and Sarah Ruth lived was so small and crooked that Edward did not believe at first that it was a house. He mistook it instead for a chicken coop. Inside there were 2 beds and a kerosene lamp, and not much else. Bryce laid Edward at the foot of the beds, and then lit the lamp. "Sarah," Bryce whispered. "Sarah Ruth, you gotta wake up now, honey. I bring you something." He took the harmonica out of his pocket and played the beginning of a simple medley. The little girl sat up in her bed and immediately started to cough. Bryce put his hand back on her back. "That's all right," he told her. "That's okay." She was young, maybe 4 years old, and she had white blonde hair, and even in the poor light of the lamp, Edward could see that her eyes were the same gold-flecked brown as Bryce's. "That's right," said Bryce. "You go on ahead and cough." Sarah Ruth obliged him. She coughed and coughed and coughed. On the wall of the cabin, a kerosene light cast her trembling shadow, hunched over and small. The coughing was the saddest sound that Edward had ever heard, sadder even than the mournful call of the whippoorwill. Finally, Sarah Ruth stopped. Bryce said, "You want to see what I brought you?" Sarah Ruth nodded. "You got to close your eyes." The girl closed her eyes. Bryce picked up Edward and held him so that he was standing straight like a soldier at the end of the bed. "All right, now you can open them." Sarah Ruth opened her eyes, and Bryce moved Edward's china legs and china arms so it looked as if he were dancing. Sarah Ruth laughed and clapped her hands. "Rabbit," she said. "He's for you, honey," said Bryce. Sarah Ruth looked first at Edward, and then at Bryce, and then back again at Edward, her eyes wide and disbelieving. "He's yours." "Mine?" Sarah Ruth, Edward was soon to discover, rarely said more than one word at a time. Words, at least several of them, strung together, made her cough. She limited herself. She said only what needed to be said. "Yours," said Bryce. "I got him special for you." This knowledge provoked another fit of coughing in Sarah Ruth, and she hunched over again. When the fit was done, she uncurled herself and held out her arms. "That's right," said Bryce, and he handed Edward to her. "Baby?" said Sarah Ruth. She rocked Edward back and forth and stared down at him and smiled. Never in his life had Edward been cradled like a baby. Abilene had done it, nor hadn't not done it, nor had Nellie, and most certainly Bull had not. It was a singular sensation to be held so gently, yet so fiercely, to be stared down at with so much love. Edward felt the whole of his china body flood with warmth. "You going to give him a name, honey?" Bryce asked. "Jangles," said Sarah Ruth, without taking her eyes off Edward. "Jangles, huh? That's a good name. I like that name." Bryce patted Sarah Ruth on the head, and she continued to stare down at Edward. "Hush," she said to Edward as she rocked him back and forth. From the minute I first seen him," said Bryce, "I knew he belonged to you. I said to myself, that rabbit is for Sarah Ruth for sure." "Jangles," murmured Sarah Ruth. Sarah Ruth. And there's a picture of her and Bryce. Outside the cabin, thunder cracked, and then came the sound of rain falling on the tin roof. Sarah Ruth rocked Edward back and forth, and Bryce took out his harmonica and started to play, making his song keep up with the rhythm of the rain. Alright, we'll stop right there.